The first thing you understand
Don't
about the
drink
Onyx
it.
Lounge after
There
2
is
in the morning
poison.
isn't the smell of expensive tobacco, but the weight of what goes unsaid. The pulse of the deep house music was constant, a rhythmic heartbeat that shook the ice in the crystal glasses, but beneath the melody was a cold, calculating stillness. It was the silence of debts being collected and lives being signed away in the dark. I moved through the smoke like a ghost in a starch-stiffened shirt. My black vest was buttoned tight, and my bow tie felt less like an accessory and more like a noose tightening with every hour. My name is Kira Thorne, and for 3 years, this velvet-lined cage has been my world. The introduction I served vintage cognac to men who shook hands while their shadows drew knives. I carried trays for women whose laughter was as hollow as the promises they made. I was part of the furniture, a shadow in the periphery, and that invisibility was the only thing that kept me breathing. But tonight the air in the lounge changed, turned jagged. They didn't need a bouncer to clear the way. The crowd simply folded back, a human wave retreating from a predator. Lorenzo Volkov, the wolf, didn't just walk in. He took possession of the room. His reputation was a cold front moving through the city, and tonight it had settled at my bar. He was broader than the rumors suggested, moving with the immovable, lethal grace of a landslide. His suit was a midnight navy, tailored so perfectly it looked like armor, but it was his eyes that caught me off guard. Chilling, pale gray like a winter sky just before the first snow. He didn't look around with curiosity. He looked with ownership. And for one heart-stopping second, that gaze locked onto mine. I felt my pulse hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird. I quickly looked down, focusing on polishing a glass that was already gleaming, the repetitive motion of a desperate anchor in a room that suddenly felt too small. Don't look up, I told myself. Stay a ghost. But in his eyes, I knew I had already been seen. The thrum of the bass continued to vibrate through the mahogany bar, but to me, the music had become a distant, distorted echo. My world had narrowed to a single point of focus. The glass of 12-year-old scotch sitting on a silver tray at the far end of the counter. It was Julian Varkas's table. Julian, with his flashy designer suit and a smile that never quite reached his eyes, was a regular who thrived on the calculating quiet. He was a man of inherited arrogance, and tonight, he was playing a game that made my blood run cold. I moved with the mechanical grace of a ghost, wiping down the same spot on the bar, my eyes never leaving Julian's hands. He was leaning in close to a blonde woman, whispering something that made her throw her head back in forced laughter. It was the perfect screen. In that split second of manufactured distraction, Julian's hand drifted toward the tray. It was a subtle, practiced movement, the kind of motion perfected by a man who had spent his life operating in the shades of gray. From a tiny vial hidden in the palm of his hand, a single clear droplet fell into the amber liquid. There was no splash, no change in the color of the scotch, no sign to the naked eye that the drink had just become a death warrant. Julian retracted his hand with a fluid, casual ease, tapping his gold watch as if checking the time. He caught my eye for a fleeting second, and in that moment, his expression shifted to one of cruel joy. He didn't see a witness. He saw a piece of the furniture. He saw an invisible girl in a faded uniform who was born to serve, and too small to matter. The silence of power suddenly became deafening. The clink of glasses and the low murmur of the lounge felt like they were being sucked into a vacuum, leaving me in a pocket of airless terror. My bow tie, my noose, tightened until I could barely swallow. The tray was picked up by another server, a girl named Elena who had no idea she was carrying a ghost's execution orders. She began the long walk toward the VIP booth where Lorenzo Volkov sat, the shark unaware that the water had just been chummed. I felt the primal claustrophobia of the room closing in. If I spoke, I would be shattered by the Varkas family. If I stayed silent, the wolf would fall, and the power vacuum would turn the Onyx Lounge into a slaughterhouse. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, frantic and desperate for a way out. I looked at the glass as it traveled across the room, a glimmering amber beacon of impending murder. I looked at Lorenzo. He was sitting with that immovable grace, his silvered temples catching the light, completely oblivious to the invisible variable that was currently holding his life in her shaking hands. The routine motion of my polishing cloth stopped. The anchor was gone. I was no longer just a bystander watching the dust on the floor. I was the only person in the city who knew that the most powerful man in the room was about to take his last breath. The choice wasn't about the job or the club anymore. It was about whether a ghost was willing to scream. The server, Elena, was 10 steps away from Lorenzo's booth. 9 steps. The amber liquid in the glass caught the low light of the chandeliers, shimmering with a lethal, hidden beauty. My hands were beneath the bar, hidden by the heavy mahogany ledge, and they were shaking with a violence I couldn't control. The calculating quiet of the room had become a physical weight, pressing against my lungs, making every breath a shallow, jagged struggle. I reached for a stack of white paper napkins tucked near the garnish tray. My fingers fumbled, the starch-stiffened fabric feeling like sandpaper against my skin. I needed a pen. My eyes darted frantically, finally landing on the silver ballpoint I used to track tabs, abandoned near the register. I grabbed it, my knuckles white, and ducked my head low, pretending to check a requisition slip. "Don't do it," the ghost in me whispered. "Stay invisible. If you stay silent, you survive. If you speak, the wolf isn't the only one who dies tonight." But then I saw Sarah Thorne, or rather, the memory of a woman like my mother, who had ironed her uniform to a lethal edge, and taught me that even a shadow has a soul. I couldn't watch a man be slaughtered like a prize animal while I polished the silver. I pressed the pen to the napkin. The ink bled into the soft fiber, spreading like a dark omen. "Don't drink it," I scribbled, my handwriting a frantic, jagged scrawl that mirrored the hammering of my heart. "Fake phone call. Leave now." I folded the napkin once, a small, inconspicuous square. Elena was at the booth now. She set the tray down with a practiced clink. Lorenzo was looking at a document, his chilling pale gray eyes scanning the text with an immovable focus. Julian Varkas was watching from the periphery, his gold watch glinting as he raised his own glass in a silent, mocking toast to a dead man walking. "Elena!" I hissed, my voice a sharp thread that barely carried over the thrum of the bass. He turned startled. "Kira, what is it?" "I'm in the middle of I forgot the lemon twist for the Volkov table," I lied, my voice cracking. "Move. I'll take it." I didn't give her a chance to argue. I snatched a small crystal dish of lemons and stepped out from behind the safety of the bar. The transition from the ghost's sanctuary to the open floor felt like stepping onto a gallows. The eyes of the room, the wolf's eyes, seemed to track my every movement. My heart was a trapped bird, beating so hard I feared it would shatter my ribs. I reached the booth. Lorenzo didn't look up, but I felt the long, dark shadow of his presence fall over me. My hand moved toward the glass of 12-year-old scotch. My fingers were cold, sweating against the crystal. As I placed the lemon dish down, I slid the folded napkin beneath the heavy base of his glass. It was a paper gamble, a single inch of white fabric that held the weight of a city's peace. I felt the friction of the paper against the wood, the soft shirt of a secret being delivered. For a terrifying second our eyes met. Lorenzo's gaze was like a winter sky, frozen and sharp. I saw the moment he felt the uneven surface beneath his drink. I saw the subtle shift in his cliff face expression. My breath hitched. I had broken the cardinal rule. I was no longer invisible. I had stepped out of the velvet-draped cage and into the predator's line of sight. I turned to walk away, my legs feeling like lead, waiting for the sound of the glass hitting the floor, or the sound of a gun clearing its holster. I didn't wait to see him read it. I turned, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and began the long walk back toward the bar. Every step felt like wading through deep water. I waited for the sound of his chair scraping back, for the heavy tread of his boots as he followed my instruction to vanish. I had given him the exit. I had given him the fake phone call. All he had to do was play the part and let me slip back into the shadows of the lounge. I was 3 feet away when the world abruptly stopped. A hand, large and possessing the immovable strength of a cliff face, clamped around my wrist. The grip wasn't a tentative reach. It was a vice, certain and absolute. The shock of the contact was electric, sending a jolt of primal claustrophobia straight to my throat. I was jerked backward, not with violence, but with a terrifying calm authority that brooked no resistance. I stumbled, my heels catching on the plush carpet, and before I could gasp, I was pulled flush against the side of the VIP booth. Lorenzo didn't look at me. He didn't even acknowledge the girl whose pulse was currently thrumming against his palm like a trapped bird. Instead, he reached out with his free hand, picked up the glass of 12-year-old scotch, and shifted the napkin. He read the note. I watched his eyes scan my frantic scrawl, his expression remaining an unreadable mask of ice. He didn't stand. He didn't reach for a phone. Instead, he set the glass back down, not on the napkin, but directly on the polished wood, and then he did something that made my blood turn to slush. He pulled me closer, forcing me to stand directly beside him, his grip on my wrist never wavering. He used me as a human shield, a living barrier between himself and the room. "Smile, Kira," he murmured. His voice was a low, dark vibration that I felt more than I heard. It was the first time he had spoken my name, and the sound of it in his mouth felt like a noose tightening. "You told me to smile, so do it." I looked out into the calculating quiet of the room. Across the lounge, Julian Varkas had frozen. The cruel joy on his face had been replaced by a jagged mask of calculating doubt. He was staring at us, his eyes darting from the untouched glass of scotch to the way Lorenzo held me. Varkas's gold watch glinted as his hand trembled, his glass of cognac pausing halfway to his lips. He knew the variables had shifted. He knew the invisible girl had suddenly become the center of the gravity. "He's watching us, isn't he?" Lorenzo asked, his chilling gray eyes finally drifting upward to meet mine. There was no mercy in them, only a predatory curiosity. "The man who paid for this drink. Tell me, Kira. Which one is he?" I couldn't speak. The air in the Vigneto Club felt thick, saturated with the scent of expensive tobacco and the metallic tang of impending violence. I was no longer a ghost. I was a landmark. Lorenzo's grip tightened, not to hurt, but to remind me that I was now part of his long, dark shadow. By trying to save the shark, I had let him sink his teeth into me. I stood there, pinned under the weight of his stare and the terrified gaze of the traitor across the room, realizing with a sickening finality that the smile and leave plan was dead. Lorenzo Volkov didn't flee from traps. He dismantled them, and he was going to use me as the tool to do it. The transition from the velvet-lined opulence of the lounge to the cold, clinical reality of the back offices was a blur of shadows and the rhythmic tapping of my own heels. Lorenzo did not let go of my wrist. He led me through a heavy steel door that swallowed the thrum of the bass, plunging us into a world of shades of gray. His private office was stripped of the club's performative luxury. It was a space of hard edges, slate-colored walls, and the low hum of high-end air filtration. It felt less like an office and more like a bunker. He released me as the door clicked shut, the sound echoing with an air of absolute finality. I stumbled slightly, the primal claustrophobia of the small room pressing against my chest. Lorenzo didn't go to his desk. He turned to face me, leaning back against the heavy door, his large frame blocking the only exit. The chilling pale gray of his eyes seemed to absorb the dim light, scanning me with the precision of a man looking for a flaw in a diamond. "Why?" he asked. The word was a single, sharp strike against the silence. "The Vigneto has 1,000 employees, Kira. 1,000 ghosts who see everything and say nothing. They know the rules. They know that in this city, a long life is the reward for a short memory. So tell me, why did you break the silence?" I looked at my hands, still trembling, the ink from the napkin faint on the pads of my fingers. My heart was still a trapped bird, but the air in this room was different. There were no witnesses here, No Julian Varkas to mock my clothes or my background. It was just the ice and the panic. Because I'm tired of the dust, I said. My voice was a whisper at first, but it gathered a strange, jagged strength. I looked up, meeting his gaze for the first time without dropping my eyes. For 3 years, I've watched men like you and Varkas treat this club like a chessboard. I've seen the way you look at people like me. As if we're just part of the furniture, invisible and disposable. Varkas didn't just want to kill you. He wanted to do it while I was standing there, using my hands to deliver the poison. He wanted to make me part of his cruel joy. Lorenzo tilted his head, his expression shifting from predatory curiosity to something more calculating. The immovable grace of his posture didn't break, but the shadows in his eyes seemed to deepen. Invisibility is a safety net, he murmured, his voice a low vibration. Once you speak, you can never go back to being a ghost. You've traded your cage for a war. You realize that, don't you? Varkas knows your face now. My enemies will think you're my weakness, and my allies will think you're my spy. I was never safe, I countered, finding my voice fully now. A noose is still a noose, even if it's made of velvet. If I stayed silent, I was just waiting for someone like Julian to decide my life was in the way of his profit. I didn't do it for you, Mr. Volkov. I did it because I'm the only variable in this room that hasn't been bought yet. A slow, terrifyingly calm smile spread across his face, not one of warmth, but of absolute finality. He stepped away from the door, moving into the center of the room like a landslide in slow motion. He reached out, his thumb stroking the ink stain on my finger, a touch that felt like a seal. A variable, he repeated softly. The one thing a man in my position can never find, a person who acts without a price tag. You've seen the dust on the floor, Kira. Now I'm going to make sure you see the men who swept it there. You wanted to stop being a ghost. Fine. From this moment on, you are my eyes. And in this city, the eyes are the only part of the body that the wolves don't eat. The hum of the air filtration system in the bunker-like office seemed to pulse in time with the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. Lorenzo walked to a wall-mounted map of the city's waterfront district, his immovable grace casting a long, jagged shadow across the blueprints of power. He didn't look like a man who had just escaped an assassination. He looked like a general preparing for a siege. Varkas is a symptom, Kira, not the disease, he said, his voice dropping into a low, dark vibration. He tapped a finger against a location on the map, a grand estate on the cliffs known as the Glass House. He's the hand that drops the poison, but the vial was provided by someone much higher up the food chain. Julian Varkas doesn't have the stomach to move against me unless he has a guarantee of state-sanctioned immunity. He turned back to me, the chilling pale gray of his eyes locking onto mine with a terrifying intensity. In 3 days, Senator Sterling is hosting a private gala. It's a closed-door event for the city's untouchables. My sources tell me that the final signatures for my replacement and my execution will be witnessed there. Varkas will be in attendance, waiting for the signal that the wolf has been bled dry. The primal claustrophobia I had felt in the lounge returned, but this time it wasn't born of invisibility. It was the weight of a secret too heavy to carry. I looked at the map, then back at the man who had turned my velvet cage into a war room. You want me to go there, I whispered, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. You want a waitress to walk into a room full of the people who pay her 3-year salary in a single night. I want the one variable they haven't accounted for, Lorenzo corrected, stepping closer until the scent of his expensive cologne and the cold iron of his presence overwhelmed the room. They expect me to bring soldiers. They expect me to bring lawyers. They don't expect me to bring the ghost who sees the dust on the floor. At that gala, you won't be carrying a tray. You'll be carrying a wire. You will be my eyes in the places where the calculating quiet is the thickest. I felt a cold shiver trace the line of my spine. The stakes had shifted from a single poisoned glass to the survival of the entire city's delicate balance. If Lorenzo fell, The vacuum would be filled by men like Varkas. Men who saw people like me as disposable assets to be crushed. My safety was no longer about keeping my head down and my memory short. If they catch me. I started, but the words died in my throat. If they catch you, the city burns, Lorenzo said with absolute finality. But if we win, the noose around your neck finally breaks. You aren't just saving me anymore, Kira. You're ensuring that the men who think they own your silence finally learn what it sounds like when a ghost screams. He reached out, his hand momentarily resting on the door handle, effectively sealing the pact. The shades of gray in the room seemed to solidify around us. I realized then that there was no retreat to the Vigneto Club, no returning to the stiff white shirt and the spotless glass. I had traded my invisibility for a seat at the table of predators, and my only hope of survival was to ensure the biggest wolf in the room remained the one standing. I looked at the map one last time, my resolve hardening into a jagged edge. I wasn't just a bystander anymore. I was the leak in a conspiracy that had underestimated the power of the person they never bothered to look at. The transition from the Vigneto Club's backroom to the hidden dressing suite within Lorenzo's estate felt like a shedding of a previous life. For 3 years, the stiff white shirt and black vest had been my skin, a uniform that signaled my submission to the calculating quiet. Now, those clothes lay in a discarded heap on the marble floor, replaced by a gown of midnight silk that felt like liquid shadow. As I stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back. The trapped bird was still there, visible in the frantic pulse at the base of my throat, but the ghost in a uniform had been replaced by something sharp and expensive. The dress was a masterpiece of shades of gray and deep blacks, tailored to make me blend into the high society background while looking like I belonged there. Lorenzo stood in the doorway, his immovable grace reflected in the glass behind me. He didn't offer a compliment. He offered a warning. He walked toward me, his heavy tread silent on the plush carpet, and reached out to adjust the diamond pendant at my neck. His fingers were cold, a stark reminder of the ice that governed his world. "The dress is a distraction, Kira," he murmured, his chilling gray eyes meeting mine in the mirror. "It is designed to make the men in that room look at you without actually seeing you. They will see a companion, a beautiful ornament, a translator, for a Japanese investor. But you must not fall into the trap of the clothes. You cannot afford to start thinking like them." He turned me around, his grip on my shoulders firm, forcing me to find my balance in the unfamiliar height of my heels. "You are going into that gala because you have the waitress's eye. Do you understand what that is?" I looked at him, the primal claustrophobia of the task settling on my shoulders. "It means seeing the things they think are beneath them." "Exactly," Lorenzo said, his voice a low, dark vibration. "The elite are blinded by their own light. They look at the gold on the walls, but they never see the dust on the floor. They listen to the speeches, but they never hear the footsteps in the hall. As a waitress, you learn to read a room by the way a man holds his glass or the way a woman avoids eye contact with her husband. You learn to spot the poisoned pour. Because you were invisible. At this gala, if you start acting like a guest, you will die like one. You must remain a ghost, even in silk." He reached into a velvet-lined box on the vanity and pulled out a small, skin-colored earpiece. It was a tiny high-tech noose that would connect my heartbeat to his. As he tucked it behind my ear, his thumb brushed my jaw, a touch that felt like a seal on our alliance. "Tonight, you will hear the secrets they think are buried under the music," he whispered. "You will watch the hands, not the faces. You will see the movement of the vial, the exchange of the ledger, the calculating doubt in Julian Varkas's eyes. You are the only variable they haven't prepared for because they don't believe someone like you can exist in their world without a tray in her hand." I took a breath, feeling the weight of the silk and the gravity of the mission. The transformation was physical, but the waitress's shadow remained my greatest weapon. I wasn't just wearing a gown. I was wearing a disguise that would allow the ghost to finally walk through the front door of the lion's den. I met his gaze, my resolve hardening into the ice he required. The training was over. The performance was about to begin. The glass house sat atop the jagged cliffs of the city like a crown of cold light, its floor-to-ceiling windows revealing a sea of black ties and silk gowns. As I stepped from the car at Lorenzo's side, the primal claustrophobia I had felt in the Vigneto Club returned with a vengeance. But here, the calculating quiet was even more dangerous. This wasn't a crowded lounge. It was a sanctuary for the city's apex predators, a place where the air was thick with the scent of gardenias and the metallic tang of unspoken threats. Lorenzo moved through the crowd with the immovable grace of a cliff face, his hand resting possessively on the small of my back. To the world, I was a sophisticated companion, a translator for the silent Japanese investor trailing just behind us. But beneath the midnight silk of my gown, my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, frantic to escape the cage of this high-stakes performance. "Remember, Kira." Lorenzo's voice came through the tiny earpiece, a low, dark vibration that anchored me. "Watch the hands. Ignore the faces." We entered the grand ballroom, and the first person my eyes landed on was Julian Varkas. He was standing near a marble pillar, holding a flute of champagne, his flashy designer suit shimmering under the crystal chandeliers. Beside him stood Senator Sterling, a man whose smile was as sharp and cold as a razor. Varkas was laughing, but his eyes were scanning the room with calculating doubt. The moment his gaze drifted toward us, I felt a wave of panic, so cold it threatened to freeze the breath in my lungs. My waitress's eyes screamed at me to look at the floor, to vanish, to become the invisible ghost he had once ignored. But Lorenzo's hand tightened slightly against my waist, a silent command for ice. "He's looking at you, Kira. Don't blink," Lorenzo murmured. I forced myself to meet Varkas's gaze, not as a servant but as a peer. I watched him through the lens of the waitress's shadow, noticing the way his fingers tapped nervously against his glass, the same rhythm he had used before dropping the poison in the scotch. I saw the way Senator Sterling glanced toward a private study on the second floor, his hand resting briefly on a leather-bound ledger tucked under his arm. Varkas's expression shifted from arrogance to a jagged mask of confusion. He recognized the ghost, but the midnight silk and the diamond pendant at my neck created a dissonance he couldn't reconcile. He didn't see a waitress. He saw a variable he hadn't prepared for. We moved deeper into the lion's den, passing the very men who had paid for Lorenzo's execution. I stood in the same room as the men who wanted me dead, acting as the eyes and ears for a man who had turned me into a weapon. Every time Julian Varkas looked our way, I felt the noose tighten, but I didn't drop my gaze. I watched the movement of the servers, the exchange of glances between the senator and his security, and the subtle shades of gray where the real deals were being made. I was no longer just a bystander. I was the hunter's shadow, waiting for the one thread that would make their entire world unravel. "The study," I whispered into the hidden mic, my voice steady despite the screaming panic in my chest. "Varkas is waiting for the senator to move. The signatures are happening tonight." Lorenzo's lips curved into a slow, lethal smile. "Then let's give them something to sign." The gala was a masterpiece of misdirection. To the untrained eye, it was a celebration of wealth and civic duty, but through the waitress's eye, it was a crime scene in motion. While the elite were mesmerized by the clinking of crystal and the senator's booming laughter, I was watching the periphery. I was looking for the dust on the floor, those tiny discarded details that the powerful consider beneath their notice. Lorenzo moved through the crowd like a king, engaging in the calculating quiet of high-stakes small talk, but I felt the tension in the hand resting against my back. We were near the grand mahogany staircase when I saw it. It wasn't a grand gesture or a whispered secret in a dark corner. It was a simple, repetitive motion that triggered a memory from my 3 years in the velvet-draped cage. Julian Varkas stood by the buffet, his fingers drumming a nervous, jagged rhythm against a silver serving spoon. Beside him, Senator Sterling's chief of staff was complaining loudly about the temperature of the hors d'oeuvres. To anyone else, It was a trivial moment of vanity. But I saw the senator's staffer drop a white linen napkin, clean, folded, and seemingly empty, into a trash receptacle near the service entrance. A second later, Varkas accidentally dropped his own napkin and reached down to pick up both. "Lorenzo," I whispered, my voice a ghost of a sound in the earpiece. "The trash bin by the service door." Varkas didn't just pick up paper. He picked up a key. I felt Lorenzo's posture stiffen, his immovable grace turning into the coiled tension of a predator. He didn't turn his head. "A key to what, Kira?" "The service elevator," I replied, my mind racing through the logistics of the glass house. "They're not going to study. The study is the decoy. They're taking the service lift to the wine cellar. That's where the ventilation controls are. They aren't going to sign a document, Lorenzo. They're going to seal the room." I looked at the ventilation grates disguised as ornate gold scrollwork along the ceiling. I remembered the poisoned pour from the Vigneto Club. Julian Varkas didn't have the stomach for a fair fight. He preferred the invisible kill. If they flooded the ballroom with gas, the shark would be trapped in a glass box with nowhere to swim. Varkas just moved. I hissed, my heart screaming panic as I watched Julian slip through a side door meant only for the staff. "He's heading down." Lorenzo's hand tightened on mine, a touch that felt like a seal of absolute trust. He didn't call his security. He didn't make a scene. He simply turned me toward the terrace, away from the prying eyes of the guests. "You've saved my life for a second time, Kira," he murmured, his chilling gray eyes reflecting the moonlight. "The source told them I'd watch the doors. They never expected me to have someone who watches the trash." He signaled to a shadow in the garden, his real security detail, and pointed toward the service entrance. Within seconds, the calculating doubt in the room began to shift into a tactical strike. I stood there in my midnight silk, the diamond at my neck feeling like a badge of office. I had identified the variable the elite had missed because I was the only one in the room who knew that the most important deals aren't made on desks. They're made in the shades of gray where the help works. The ghost had seen the dust, and now, the wolf was going to ensure that Julian Varkas was the one who got swept away. The silence that followed the collapse of the Varkas conspiracy was not the calculating quiet of the club, but a heavy, absolute finality. In the dim, subterranean wine cellar of the glass house, the air smelled of damp earth and the metallic tang of fear. Julian Varkas was no longer the flashy predator in a designer suit. He was a broken man on his knees, his gold watch glinting mockingly under the single harsh bulb overhead. He looked at the service elevator key in Lorenzo's hand and then at me, his eyes wide with a jagged, hysterical defeat. Lorenzo stood over him with the immovable grace of a cliff face, his shadow swallowing the smaller man whole. He didn't raise a weapon. He didn't need to. The evidence I had gathered, the napkin, the key, the recorded whispers through the wire, was a sharper blade than any steel. Behind us, the senator's men were already being led away in the shades of gray of the garden, their political immunity stripped away by a waitress who knew how to look at the trash. "You were right about one thing, Julian," Lorenzo said, his voice a low, dark vibration that filled the small space. "The help is invisible. But that's why they see the things you're too arrogant to hide. You didn't lose because of a rival family or a federal raid. You lost because you underestimated the girl who cleared your table." Julian looked at me, his mouth working but no sound coming out. He saw the midnight silk of my gown, but for the first time he actually saw me. He saw Kira Thorne, the woman who had moved from the waitress's shadow into the light of the wolf. Lorenzo turned to me, his chilling gray eyes softening into something that looked dangerously like respect. He reached out and took my hand, his grip firm and steady. It was no longer the iron grip of a captor, but the seal of a vow. He pulled me to his side, and I didn't flinch. I stood tall, my shoulders square, the trapped bird in my chest finally finding its wings. "The war isn't over, Kira," he murmured, his thumb brushing against my knuckles. Sterling was just the first name in the ledger. There will be others who think they can hide in the quiet. There will be more dust on the floor. Then let them come, I replied, my voice steady and cold, echoing the ice of the man beside me. I looked down at Julian one last time. I wasn't a victim of circumstance anymore. I wasn't the girl in the velvet-draped cage, waiting for the 8-hour shift to end. I was an active participant, in a world that had tried to bury me. As we walked out of the cellar and back toward the glittering lights of the city, I realized the noose of my bow tie was gone. I had chosen my side in the shadows, and as the wolf's shadow lengthened across the cliffs, I knew that the city would never look at a ghost the same way again. The silence was finally mine to command.